Welcome to the Capital Brief, here with my colleague, John Tamny. John, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Seth Berenzweig, and we're experiencing American election hangover. There's a lot that's been going on, obviously, over the last week or so. A lot to dig into as it relates to the market, the economy, COVID, and where we go from here. So, John, I'm going to give you the first jump ball and ask you to kind of bring this entire hot mess into order. Where are we? And, set the table for us. Where do we sit as we are here today with the election just really kind of coming to a conclusion and seeing where we go next in America?
Well, I think as a nation, there's a bit of division. There are some within the Trump camp of the 71 million who feel that they were wronged or that this is illegitimate. This is not the first time. That was the view on the other side in 2016. I think, on the other hand, the stock market, which is the truth teller and always and everywhere they'll look into the future, has already moved on. The stock market got the certainty that it wanted. Divided government, which is ideal for the economy, ideal for market returns. You have Republicans who will probably control the Senate. There's really no scenario at this point under which they won't have a 52-48 majority. Joe Biden.
You think George is in the bag as far as?
George is in the bag because once you have a runoff, you're removing all the candidates who pulled votes from Loeffler and Perdue before. So
right.
George is in the bag. North Carolina just happened in favor for Tom Tillis. And so this is actually the best of all scenarios. Joe Biden can now blame Republicans when he doesn't go hard left. And Republicans can be the opposition party that they're most comfortable being. And so it's a happy scenario economically, probably in the stock market too. And so it's reflecting that we've moved on. We've got a new president.
Are you surprised how significantly the stock market scooped up? Because it was really a very quick and very definitive reaction in that regard. Did that surprise you in any way?
No, it didn't, and one reason is that I keep getting information from Ken Fisher. I think he's one of the great people that I'm lucky enough to have regular contact with, and he said, get in before this because once the market has certainty, you don't want to wait for that certainty. Get in now.
Right. And you could argue that it's kind of a Goldilocks scenario, really, for the market if you have a close edge by the Republicans, because if you end up at 52-48, that moderates the White House and kind of cancels out the Bernies and the AOCs of the world, and allows the moderate Republicans, such as Murkowski and Romney and Collins and so forth, to come along for the ride when we have a close vote on something that, as a matter of principle, Biden is leaning forward on that they may feel is good for the country. So I think that there's a lot of good and there's a lot of hope. And in America, we need hope because, especially after the bruising election, and you very aptly put when we were speaking the other day, the stock market looks forward. It's a future predictor. It expresses what's happening in the future, not what's happening yesterday or today. Mm-hmm. So we could use some positive energy in America, and I think that I take a lot of hope in what you're saying. But I think there's another story that's going on in America as we sit here today that I think adds to the landscape. And I don't mean to be the Debbie Downer of the day here, but while I agree with you as far as the market is concerned, and certainly Pfizer's vaccine news has been incredibly uplifting, and that it could literally be something that saves the world. Let's take stock of some of the other pieces on the table. As we sit here today, just days out of the election, we're sitting in a situation where one could argue that the vote from historic standards was really not that close. I understand that there are still a number of states in play. However, it looks like Biden's going to end up winning the popular vote by roughly 5 million votes. It looks like Biden's going to win the Electoral College by about 300 plus points. And yet, we're sitting in a time where the government refuses to cooperate with a transition. I know that it's not over till it's over. It certainly seems like it's over to me, and it looks like the fat laddie already sang and went home and cracked open a beer. So I'm really having a hard time with what's going on. Let's take a look at what's going on in the small business world. Small businesses are getting crushed. There was a study issued by Yelp yesterday that said that of all small businesses that close temporarily in the United States, over 60% of them are estimated to be closed permanently. In addition to small businesses being destroyed, and roughly 1 in 5 small business CEOs who were polled said that they believe that they can't survive until Christmas. Big business is also getting destroyed. Retail is getting decimated. Lord & Taylor has been wiped out. And we're sitting in a time right now in America where we have complete desperation in a number of small and mid-sized and big businesses in the United States. We have skyrocketing COVID cases, but yet when the president is not facilitating a transition and people are out in the streets complaining about voter fraud, to me, I find that to be very disheartening and very confusing, because in the business world right now, we really have a problem. And, you know, the market says one thing, but are you seeing other cross currents within the marketplace that says that we've got a big problem here? I mean, 70 days is a long time until the next administration steps in.
Well, I think that there's a number of issues there. I think the first thing that needs to be said is that the unwillingness to concede among voters and the president is a symptom, but it's not the real problem. The real problem is that historically we were supposed to go to bed early on election night, and we were, because the president's powers are few and defined. Really, the federal government's powers are few and defined. Republicans and Democrats basically ran roughshod over the Constitution over the last 90 years, and so here we have it. There's so much stock put in elections, and so I do think to some degree that's a symptom as opposed to the real problem. Small and big business, yeah, when you lock down, when you limit the ability of businesses to figure out their way around a virus, this is what you're going to have. Small businesses are a consequence of large. I would just point out, it's not like this is new. Let's remember, before the coronavirus came, there was the view at the time that, oh wait, Amazon's going to put every retailer out of business. Retailers had already started to go. That's a sign of economic dynamism. If shopping mall looks the same today as it did 20 years ago, we'd know that the U.S. economy had stagnated in a major way. So to some degree, this is just a natural process. It's clearly been exacerbated by this odd decision to fight virus with economic desperation.
What do you mean by that, fighting virus with economic desperation?
Well, because the view was, okay, there's a virus on the way, so let's shut things down, let's lock people down, let's force them to stay home, let's tell what we deem government non-essential businesses that you can no longer operate. How odd that is, because if you look historically, what has always been the biggest enemy of virus, of death, of starvation? It's been prosperity, economic growth. In the 19th century, medicine was very primitive, and it was because we hadn't created enough wealth that could be then pushed off to fund medical advances. And so how strange to fight a virus with economic decline when historically it's been economic growth that's brought viruses to their knees.
Well, but do you think that the administration provided the means by which business could have stayed open? Absolutely. If you talk to the small business owners that were instructed, shut down and close your doors for several weeks, they're loving what they're hearing you saying right now. But you know, at the same time, there needs to be some kind of a way to help facilitate that. Trump tells the schools open, but the schools are saying that's a great idea, but we need some help to be able to make that happen. Were there enough mechanisms in place? Was there enough help in place to be able to actually make that a reality?
Well, it's a great question, and I would first say it's not Trump's role. He does not have the power one way or the other. Presidents aren't dictators. 50 states had different plans. Obviously, New York locked down substantially. South Dakota didn't really at all. Neither did Iowa. Texas locked down late. Florida locked down the latest of the major states and opened up relatively quickly. Let's not forget that when Georgia reopened, Donald Trump belittled their Republican governor, said that's not your right. Well, no, in fact it is. And so states can make these decisions. Where I think Trump could have been more effective is in saying, why on earth? He should have gone to those states locking down and say, why would you do this? Why would you exacerbate virus with economic desperation? Let businesses figure out ways to stay open. Some were going to close altogether. Some were going to stay fully open. Right. You need a mix.
Well, you need a mix and you need engagement. You need more than platitudes from Washington. People in the business community, I feel, often see bureaucrats as being kind of closed off from business reality. It's all fine and good for the president to say open, but if there's no actual engagement on how to do that, or at least to try to provide some kind of active guidance with the governors and coordination, it really comes up short. You know, I noticed something that happened just the other day, which I think is directly related to what we're talking about and demonstrates how everybody could have done better. And by the way, not just the White House. I think everybody could have done better, Republicans and Democrats. I was taking a look at the newly constituted advisory board for how to be able to deal with and conclude, for the most part, the coronavirus. It's a very able board, very smart people, but I saw three big picture preliminary takeaways from what they say. They're saying, you know, the question is, look, what are we going to do? What are the next steps? So there were three things that I took down in my notes. The first is that they're going to be recommending the creation of new financing programs for businesses to be able to acquire protective equipment, not only in terms of PPE clothing, but in terms of physical barriers, plexiglass, things that companies can do to be open, stay open, get the equipment to be able to bring that in, and create financing programs and options that are going to be generated and encouraged through the feds. I thought that was interesting. Secondly, they're going to be rolling out a more specific, purposeful program for rapid testing. Why not have a rapid testing availability program where you're going to let people test before they come in so that you can have a roughly 90% certainty that people that are coming in, regardless of whether they're symptomatic or not, probably don't have the virus. And thirdly, they're going to be creating what they call a national dashboard, organized by zip code, so that people in the business community and otherwise can look in and see real data of what's going on in their community. When I took a look at this, I couldn't help but ask myself, and again, I'm not blaming one party over the other. I think that both parties really let everybody down. Where were these ideas before? Where were these solutions where we could let scientists come in, provide some kind of an idea of helping companies open up? If the only idea that the government had was, to your point, close your doors, lock it up, go home, and go into economic destitution, where was the federal government? Do you really think that there were things that were low-hanging fruit that could have been done to help American business over the last several months?
I do, but I don't think it's going to be an answer that's going to please too many. I write about it in my next book, When Politicians Panic. Let's get that out of the way. But to me, policy was always a non sequitur. Were we asking for policy to help businesses in February of 2020? No, and why weren't we? Because businesses weren't locked down. If you remove these limits, do we suddenly think businesses are going to say, come one, come all? No, they're going to do exactly what you say. They're going to put up plastic partitions. They're going to maybe do surge pricing on dining, as in if you come in at 4 o'clock, it'll be lower prices. You come in at 7:30, it's going to be higher prices.
Okay.
They were going to figure out ways. Why would we let the very people who gave us the DMV suddenly instruct businesses on how to operate, how to meet the needs of their customers? So I think the mistake was always in terms of policy. I don't know why I have a smartphone, but I've got a supercomputer in my pocket. Why do we always, when politicians deem a crisis, suddenly basically set up central planning, whereby very few people set the plan for a nation?
So you're saying that if there was an opportunity of a more concrete strategy to provide some kind of policies or some kind of federal programs to put up the plexiglass, to put up the dividers, to create that kind of institutionalized assistance, that would be something that you wouldn't be in favor of?
No, I wouldn't be in favor of it for the simple reason that no business ever runs out of money. What happens is businesses run out of the trust of investors and lenders. And remember in the year 2000, Amazon.org. Why was it Amazon.org? Because it could not make profits, yet investors were patient. They saw the future. They thought, this is eventually going to work. The virus happened. Suddenly, businesses experienced a big drop-off in customers. If they had just been free at that point to make the changes necessary to bring customers back in, I think a lot of lenders, a lot of investors would have said, you're good for the long term. We are going to invest in you. But what they instead they did, lockdown, at which point the government was made the one source of capital, because who else was going to direct capital toward businesses when there was uncertainty as to when the lockdowns were going to end, how they were. That's precisely why you want no federal response.
Shut down, take the PPP, forced to take the money, maybe have to provide it back as a loan. In other words, let the free market reign.
Yeah, it sounds so trite. Oh, let markets work. But this was a classic example of why you let markets work. Because let's be clear, Disney was probably going to shut down its parks in total. It had too much to lose. Assuming this had been a major threatening virus that killed a lot of people, Disney couldn't take that brand risk. The corner store was going to take that brand risk. A new business, a new restaurant was going to. And the beauty of this, the beauty of hundreds of millions of different decisions, was that the small businesses that couldn't risk shutting down were going to show Disney how to reopen. Here's what customers want. Here's what makes them most comfortable. And so when you have one-size-fits-all solutions, which is what what these federal and local solutions were, you actually blind the markets and you blind the people to how to get back to normal operations.
Well, I think that, I have two reactions to that. The first is I think that there are times where the free market needs a little bit of help, and that taking a complete step back approach without providing some kind of policy guidance and some kind of information about how to be able to eradicate a virus, there's a time and a place for an extreme on both sides, and there's a time for a hybrid approach. But the second point that I think is being raised here is, why wasn't this conversation that you and I are having right now something that was more actively going on in Washington, D.C.? I spend so much time watching people fight and yell at each other rather than having conversations of people speaking with each other. There are times that you and I sit down where we agree, and there are times that we disagree. But why the hell weren't people who are in control in Washington capable of sitting down at a table over a coffee or a beer or anything and having conversations and coming up with some kind of middle ground? It's as if America right now is fighting over things that they don't need to fight over, because first of all, if you have the conversation, let the leaders lead. To people in Washington, do your job. Have the conversations. Don't just sit there with your arm crossed. Have these conversations and figure out what's going on rather than dictating. And it also involves, regardless of where the election ends up, let's talk a little bit about where the election ends up right now. We are on the cusp of it's a definite maybe that the election is over. Where are we right now, and do you see any kind of contrary indicators out there that are worth mentioning, or is this just a completely done deal?
It's hard to imagine for me that this is anything but a done deal. It's not just that it looks like Biden's won numerically, as you point out. It's that the nation has moved on. Media, left and right, have for the most part moved on. So the idea that you can come back and rewrite history at this point seems hard to imagine. I do think, however, it's interesting. Real Clear Politics is hardly a fringe organization. In fact, it's a very highly credible, respected, quoted constantly by both sides at the highest of politics.
Right.
They have since retracted their confirmation of Pennsylvania for Biden. And okay.
Why do you think they've done that?
Well, I think that they see that there's still votes that need to be counted. It's possible that their view is that there are still questions about how the ballots were counted in the first place. But I do think this should be respected. 71 million Americans did vote for Donald Trump. Their voices should be heard in this way. I think it's also worth pointing out that Al Gore took 37 days to acknowledge George W. Bush's victory. Fascinating if you look back on that. If they had counted in the way that the Gore people wanted, Bush would have won Florida going away. If they counted in the way that Bush's people wanted, Gore would have won Florida. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to say, let's give them some time, let's give the president some time to concede.
Yeah, it's still relatively early, and obviously we need to let the process play out. I agree with you. But one of the things that I really can't help but take away from these people that are in the streets from both sides of the equation, and when I say these people, I mean that in a very heterogeneous manner, because you have Republicans, you have Democrats, you have people who are happy with the election. You have people that are unhappy with the election. You have people that are dancing in the streets. You have people that are not dancing. This country right now is experiencing an internal Cold War. We're in a period of time where almost half of the country is in such strong disagreement with the other part of the country that there's a lot of distrust and a lot of hate that's going on right now. And one of the things that I think is really happening right now is that we're at a moment of historic reckoning in America. If we have had a recognized history of deconfliction regarding relationships abroad, I think that we have to ask ourselves, why can't we set up some kind of deconfliction at home? What are some of the things that we can do here that can try to help us start to have these conversations again? What are some of the things that we can take away to be able to specifically say to the people in Washington, when we tell you to do your job and not just sit there and make pretend that face masks cause COVID, as opposed to at least having some kind of a positive impact on that, how about having some kind of program or policy in place to have a conversation? What can we do, John, to learn from where we are today to try to help America do some kind of a healing process? Because right now, the idea of coming together and healing just sounds like a bunch of lip service to me.
Well, because it ignores once again why the nation is at odds. Now, let's be fair. It's not as though the nation was unanimous in 1865 or 1860. There have always been partisan fights. This is hardly a new thing. But are we surprised that the nation's so divided when a constitution that ascribes powers to the federal government that are few and defined is basically a dead letter, that neither side abides it, that both sides, when they're in power, do things that the Constitution, it doesn't take a legal scholar to say that's probably something that should happen in cities and states, and that was the design. Let's have the fights locally. Because we've turned the Constitution on its head, the fights are national. So I don't think we should be too surprised by what's happening here.
Well, I think a lot of it is, frankly, and I half the time I feel like I'm speaking like a Democrat. The other half the time I think I'm speaking like a Republican, when frankly I'm very much a moderate. But I think that the media has really played a lot into this. But I think the public really has a lot to blame too. There's a real crisis of media literacy in America. People are, based upon the current technological environment, are really able to cocoon themselves in their own sound and echo chambers, where they're going to listen to their station on television. They're going to listen to their news feed on Facebook that has the algorithm that's going to continue to just throw the same slop in front of them. And we have a real problem in America with media illiteracy. And we also have a problem with media disinformation. I mean, forget about throwing all the blame at the doorstep of the feds. Companies are doing a really lousy job protecting against disinformation. Let's take a look at what happened with the Hunter Biden laptop situation. Let's not even get into whether it was fake news or not. I think it was ridiculously bogus, but there are millions and millions of Americans that think otherwise. How fascinating was it to watch Ted Cruz just take the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, to the back of the woodshed? Jack Dorsey, during that hearing that happened only about 2 weeks ago about the impact of the internet and social media on the electoral process in America, looked like a complete buffoon. He looked like a complete fool because there was no written, clear, transparent policy about how they're going to deal with this situation. How, after 2016, these social media companies could have no clue, and Jack Dorsey could walk out of there. He basically looked like he just climbed out of his basement after hunkering down for 60 days without shaving. He looked like he hadn't even bathed. Sorry about that, but it's just the reality. And to not even be prepared for that, where are we in terms of the basic technological and economic structures in America to help preserve American democracy and let people have a clue about what are the transparent processes that we're going to have so that we can have a fair and meaningful election?
Well, I come at this far more optimistically. I think the media today is exponentially better than it was. And I think with Jack Dorsey, it's his right. I think businesses can make economic decisions to do things in ways that we don't necessarily like. Let's remember AOL and Yahoo were the top internet companies in 2000. They're not today. If Twitter doesn't succeed, someone will replace it if it doesn't do the right things. But let's go back to 1984. Ronald Reagan runs for re-election, and according to the USA Today story on it, 93% of the media about him was negative. And you can imagine most of it was negative about the economy. The economy was growing, but it was all about homelessness and everything. Back then, the media was the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, 3 networks, PBS. It was monolithically left-wing. Finally, today, we have new sources, new slants, new angles for information. I could not have been in that old media, yet today I get to have my reflexively libertarian viewpoint beamed around the world
Democracy
on a
of
daily
input.
basis.
Right.
And so I think compared to the past, what Reagan was up against, what we have today is beautiful. And so, yes, there's big debates. Yes, people get their very narrow news feeds, but compared to what they used to have, I submit to you that, again, the big problem is we have government that does too much on the national level, and hence we get divided government.
So you think that there should be less regulation of social media and as opposed to trying to encourage or step into telling them how to do things a little bit more transparently?
Unquestionably. What has happened to Republicans? They used to say that we want to regulate businesses less. We
Right.
want businesses to make economic decisions. Now you have them calling CEOs before Congress and
Dragging
basically
them
saying,
under subpoena, by the way.
And Republicans were always correctly against affirmative action, I think.
Right.
Well, suddenly, you're not giving us a fair enough shake at Facebook and Twitter. Maybe you should change your algorithms so that our viewpoints reach more people.
Who the hell elected you,
Yeah,
right?
what's happened to Republicans? How about do what Fox did? People can love or hate Fox, but Fox is a beautiful story of an entrepreneur, Rupert Murdoch, saying, okay, the right of center viewpoint is not being heard, it's not being ministered. I'm going to create a
Right.
news source that meets that need.
And compete.
Yeah, and has been very competitive.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I keep coming back to the Reagan joke of the time that you need to be scared is when someone says, "Hi, I'm here from the federal government. I'm here to help." Listening to the absurdity of Ted Cruz just bashing the Twitter CEO, Jack Dorsey, who someone really needs to tell him to at least, I don't need to sound like my mother who says, comb your hair, but I mean, the guy made the Flintstones look like they were cutting edge. That is pure political hypocrisy. And although I don't agree with your 100% free market view, here's where I'm in strong agreement. The bureaucrats are clueless. Their interest is in political circus, and when Ted Cruz goes on and starts bashing small and big tech because he's saying that he doesn't like the messaging, I say to Ted Cruz, why don't you just stand down, back up, and just do your job? Because these companies, they need to do a better job. There's no question about that, but let them compete. Let them compete. Just a couple of years ago, Newsmax, for example, really wasn't very competitive. They're a very strong conservative voice right now. Newsmax is really having kind of a renaissance, and they're coming up. You've got Newsmax, you have AON, everybody talks about Fox. There are a number of conservative places. There's no shortage of liberal places to be able to get your news, linear and otherwise. So, but the problem is, how do you deal with misinformation? How do you deal with that? Is it just going to the social media is now the public water cooler of a transmission and exchange of ideas. You and I have seen complete misinformation and disinformation. How do we deal with that?
Well, you deal with it with more information. Come one, come all. There's going to be different ways. The way in which we get our news today, odds it won't be the same 5 years from now. I think a perfect example of misinformation is I think the New York Times is the best newspaper on earth. But I think the headlines are horrific.
How do you mean?
Every single day, Biden takes over as the virus rages. Well, let's think about what that is. Is the virus raging, or does the richest country in the world test more than anyone else? Indonesia's got 270 million inhabitants. We've got 330 million.
Right.
They've tested 8 citizens per 1,000. The U.S., as of a few weeks ago, had tested 150 million people. You think you're going to have a few more cases in the United States as a consequence? And see, the New York Times reports all this in the internal pages. It also reports that of the coronavirus deaths in the United States, over 45% happen to people in nursing homes.
Right.
And then we go from was that fake news? Is it fake news from CDC that of the coronavirus deaths, 94% happen to people with pre-existing conditions? Are people dying, or is there blood in the street in the United States in the way that the front page of the New York Times would indicate? Or is there something far more nuanced going on?
Well, but if you take a data
and thank goodness for the opposite, for the other media that gives us this information.
Well, agreed, but you certainly have more than your fair share of other countries, for example, in Southeast Asia, that have done per capita a much more effective job at containing COVID than we have. I grant you that the fatality rate of being well under 1% is something that is not exactly front and center on page 1 of the New York Times or covered by CNN. But by the same token, has the administration really been completely honest? I mean, there are people in America that believe that there is no coronavirus. People have been shoveled down their throats so much misinformation that part of the problem there is that when you have a vaccine, there's going to be a lot of people in America that aren't going to take it because they don't even think that we have a problem right now. Whereas if you look at other countries that have dealt with this specifically, New Zealand, South Korea, other countries in Southeast Asia, they really have it pretty much under control. Do we really have it under control right now?
Well, I wonder, is it so under control, something that half of people don't even know they have? They're just wholly asymptomatic, that other people who get it find that it's not that wrenching of a situation to go through? Is the federal government supposed to be having a national plan for it? Would you try, for me, is it a Trump thing? I didn't want Barack Obama planning the response to a virus either. What would a politician know about this? Why is it that every time some crisis comes up, the answer is central planning? Central planning doesn't work in any other space. We wouldn't want them central planning our smartphones. If they did, we wouldn't have them. We wouldn't want them central planning cars. We wouldn't want them central planning flight. Back when the Wright brothers were trying to fly planes, people said they were nuts. It would never happen. It was accepted wisdom in the Washington Post. Man will never fly. Get it? And so why do we expect in this that a president, regardless of party, is going to have a reasonable response?
Well, but sometimes somebody in control has to be able to at least try some kind of a policy. It's one thing to say, don't let the bureaucrats step in and sledgehammer down business. It's quite the other to go out in front of a rally and say, we're going to throw Fauci under the bus, and don't worry, we're going to fire him. We're going to fire him out. We're going to lock her up. We're going to throw the scientists under the bus. At least Biden is talking about having some kind of a plan that follows science. Isn't there some kind of a positive indicator there that's going to have a directly beneficial impact on the American economy?
Possibly, but color me skeptical. As Biden's former chief of staff, Ron Klain, pointed out, the Obama administration's handling of H1N1 was disastrous. If that had been a real virus, the number of deaths in the United States would have been enormous. And it goes back to my basic point. I don't look to my presidents to be the ones solving a virus. What could they possibly know about? What could the scientists know about? If you're really good at this, have you worked for 6 presidents, or are you out in the real world actually achieving real things? I think there's something to be said that this is precisely when you hand it off to people who in the real market-driven world who are going to get things right and wrong and are going to be judged based on that.
So you're talking about Merck, you're talking about Pfizer. That's what you're talking about,
without
right?
question, because it's not that they don't get everything else, get everything right, but that's the point.
Right.
Need I remind you that in 1983, one Anthony Fauci wrote a report saying that AIDS could be passed around by me just being in the same room as you. He was wrong. It doesn't mean he's stupid. He's obviously brilliant. But there was so little we knew at the time. The NHS in England at the time put up signs, 1 in 5 Brits was going to get AIDS. They got it wrong. Remember Dynasty, the TV show? The fear was that Rock Hudson making out with Linda Evans, he may have passed on AIDS. We didn't know things.
That's about
and
a million
so to
years ago.
presume now
Yeah.
that we know that Fauci and Redfield know things, that they've got peerless information on this, is just naive. That's why you want to leave it to people trying different things away from government.
But the government needs to find a way to be able to work with science. The government needs to be able to find a middle ground, to be able to say, I'm going to stay out of your way, corporate America. I'm going to let you do your thing, but we're not going to step out and we're not going to throw scientists under the bus. We're not going to tell people that face masks cause COVID, because that's ridiculous. We've heard garbage from both sides. The Democrats and the Republicans have in some ways done an equally bad job. But it has been amazing to me that this administration has basically cut the throat of the scientists and not even wanted to get them involved, and instead is more interested in whipping things up to kind of bring things into, dare I say, a positive conclusion as we continue to have conflicts here in America. The corporate America is doing a phenomenal job and is providing a very upbeat aspect of really literally saving the country and saving the world. Look at what Pfizer has done, as well as other companies like 3M with rapid testing strips. But Pfizer has come up with something that even Dr. Fauci, with his hand-wringing on some of the networks, says is probably going to be out and about by December. It will probably go to people most at risk first, as well it should. But you know, leave us, as I think that you often do, on a very positive note. How is American business and corporate America going to be the one, rather than the feds, to help lead us out of this crisis and into a powerful year next year economically?
Well, American business is going to bring us to a happier place, precisely because in business there's failure. Silicon Valley is not the richest, most innovative sector of the world because all of its ideas succeed. It's the richest and most innovative precisely because just about every business formed out there fails. In government, it's not a Republican or Democrats thing. It's a lack of failure thing. There are not market signals judging you in rapid fire fashion saying this isn't working. And so corporate America and corporate around the world always works because the bad ideas are starved and the precious capital is moved to a higher use as a consequence.
One of the most powerful things that corporate America also does is they have internal discussions and they agree to disagree. And in one of my favorite business books, Good to Great by Jim Collins, he says that one of the most potent corporate atmospheres in America that brings about skyrocketing growth is not agreement but disagreement. The ability to sit down with people on the other side of the table and have these kinds of conversations to talk about what they disagree on, how to be able to come together. And my question to Washington, D.C., regardless of who runs things in 2021 is, can you all just sit down and have a conversation? You're there to work for the American people. You're there to help make sure that people don't die, that businesses succeed, and that we get things back on track. Get in there, sit down, have a conversation, do your job, and don't lead division. Lead bringing us together and uniting us. And when we're able to turn on the American economy and get this crisis behind us, and it looks like we will next year, there's nothing that the economy can't do. And that's why we are really the most powerful nation on earth. John, thanks again for a great conversation. I'm sure that they will be continuing things to unfold here in the nation's capital, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Absolutely.